The 80s, the 1980s, a decade that would define America as many things. A superpower, an epicenter for pop culture and counterculture entirely. The purveyors of technological advancements that would later go on to shape modern technology. A nation that would be so overrun with many issues that it still affects the country to this day. A time in a country where pure, unadulterated decadence and traditional family values once coexisted alongside one another. This was the 80s in a nutshell. And at the top of the decade, a new leader would emerge to take the reins away from President Carter. By this time, most Americans weren't too pleased with how Carter handled certain issues. One incident had rocked his administration to its core and tested his leadership. A mission called Operation Eagle Claw, which was an attempt to end the Iran hostage crisis. But things went south when 8 servicemen ended up getting killed accidentally during the operation. This caused an uproar. Fast forward to 1980. Election time had arrived and the public made a choice going forward into the new decade. His name was none other than Ronald Reagan. He had previously failed to capture the top spot, but in 1981, it was his time to lead the country. Voters had put their faith in someone who could steer the country in a better direction. Now, many can debate whether if this was a great direction. This depends on which group of people you ask. But one thing remains factual. Ronald Reagan's presidency defined the 80s almost entirely. For instance, he employed strategies to combat communism during the Cold War, and another war that greatly affected many on our own soil. The war on drugs. A war that, unfortunately, didn't benefit minorities in the slightest, as it enforced mass incarceration over rehabilitation. Speaking of America, music and television would start to reflect the issues that were going on in the nation. Let's take youth culture for instance. Many teenagers in America had evolved from the days of protesting against the war. Instead, they were about just setting trends and differing themselves from the pack. The biggest evolution that affected youth culture was the placement of more cable boxes in homes across the country. To be specific, it was one channel that would change the television landscape forever and shape the 80s going forward. That channel was none other than MTV. From the very first broadcast, Video Killed a Radio Star, MTV had grown into one of the biggest successes of the decade. This was in part of introducing a new audience to the concept of a VJ and also, of course, a channel where music lived 24 hours a day. The channel had shaken the music industry to its core. It was a time when people had grown so tired of disco. So much that in 1979, an event was held at Chicago's Comiskey Park. An event where fans could attend the game between the White Sox and Detroit Tigers for only 98 cents if they brought a disco record with them. So, what was the point of bringing these said records? Well, to smash them, of course, and unfortunately, blowing them up as well. But there was one thing that they didn't account for on that night of July 12, 1979. A riot. Yes, a full-fledged riot. Today, it's now known as Disco Demolition Night. But in the 80s, it would be known as the night that disco died. So, in due time, an influx of new artists started to emerge on the scene and create new sounds from the ashes of disco. Soon, new wave, high NRG, hip-hop, and electronic music had become the new musical standards. Soon enough, many record companies either signed new acts that represented the sounds of the day or artists that were already making records prior who had changed their sound. This in turn made artists migrate their videos to the channel, and many of them would become synonymous with the network. For instance, there was Madonna, She would release her self-titled debut album in 1983. Fueled by her first single, Everybody, Madonna had sold like gangbusters. But it would be her other singles that made her a hot commodity on the charts, such as Holiday and Burning Up. Soon enough, her videos for this album were a huge hit on the network. She would become a staple on the channel for many years that followed. Then you had Prince, who had made his mark in the latter half of the 1970s. But in the 80s, he was on a new path to greatness. He released his third album, Dirty Mind, to the masses and gained him moderate success. But it would be his sixth album that would cement him in the echelon of greats. This album would be none other than Purple Rain. The album was accompanied by a film of the same name, and it would spawn such hits as Purple Rain, I Would Die For You, and When Doves Cry. The film itself would be a product of music and film meshing together for one experience. Purple Rain wouldn't only garner his first #1 spot ever on the Billboard 100, but it would also garner him 3 Grammys that year. And it would also spark controversy. Anybody who was listening to Prince at this time knows how risque he was. And this extended to his videos as well. Nevertheless, he became a huge success on the channel. Whereas Madonna and Prince had immense success in both formats, one man would outdo them both. His album had sold a whopping 35 million copies by the end of 1983, something unheard of in the music industry, especially around that time. Not only that, it would become the best-selling album for 2 years straight. The man who crafted that masterpiece was, of course, Michael Jackson, and that album was Thriller. Coming off the success of Off the Wall, Michael knew disco was on its way out and had to change direction. Of course, the rest is history. As for MTV, Beat It would become the first music video ever by a black artist to be played on the channel. And of course, the videos were a huge success on the network, just as the singles were. From here on out, Michael Jackson became the poster child of the 80s music scene, period, bar none. On top of that, hip-hop would start to gain much more footing in the music scene. The sound would progress further past the days of Grandmaster Flash and the Furious 5 and Sugar Hill Gang. Considering how young this genre was up to this point, this was nothing short of greatness. This is the era that would birth MCs such as LL Cool J, KRS-One, Eric B. and Rakim, and Run DMC, who would later end up finding major pop success with a cover of Aerosmith's Walk This Way. And then you had Big Daddy Kane, Cool G Rap, EPMD, NWA, and a slew of other pivotal MCs that were just making their mark and shaping the culture from there on out. Hip-hop at this time became a reflection of the effects that Reagan's war on drugs had on minorities and the inner city itself. By the end of 1985, the lyrics were getting more aggressive as the conflict the people started to have with Reagan's administration started to boil over. As for movies, they would start to reflect the times as well. From the Cold War to the war on drugs, movies were displaying it front and center. For instance, Scarface would make its debut in theaters on December 9th, 1983. It told the story of a Cuban immigrant by the name of Tony Montana looking for the American dream, but he ends up becoming an American nightmare instead. Scarface was a reflection of the climate that the drug trade had on America. For example, a real-life drug lord shook America to its core with his product. That man was none other than Pablo Escobar, a man that was once known as the king of cocaine, a man that had his whole nation in a state of panic. And the success of his product even garnered him prestige as one of the richest men in the world by Forbes magazine. As for the film, it showcased the high life access and unadulterated decadence of 1980s Miami. The film would be heavily criticized for its excessive violence, but it ended up becoming one of the biggest and most talked about movies of 1984. But things wouldn't be all grim in movie theaters. Filmmakers such as Steven Spielberg and John Hughes went for the lighthearted route and heavily showcased kids as the stars this time around. Speaking of that, E.T. the Extraterrestrial would make its premiere in theaters on June 11, 1982. It would star a young Henry Thomas as Elliot Taylor and Drew Barrymore, who was just coming off her success with 1984's Firestarter, a far cry from her role in E.T. No pyrokinesis this time for our young starlet. Anyway, the film was about a young boy who befriends an alien who has been left behind on Earth. And he, along with his family, tries to keep E.T. from being taken away by the CIA, long enough so that it can find its way home. E.T. the Extraterrestrial was a huge success that year, making $800 million by the end of its box office run. As for John Hughes, he would do something different for the movie landscape, create a whole new genre, the teen movie. His first success in the newly made genre would be 1984's 16 Candles, starring a new teen sensation by the name of Molly Ringwald. The movie was a huge success and would be followed by what is considered today as one of the greatest movies of the 1980s, The Breakfast Club. This film would establish a group of actors now known as the Brat Pack, who went on to star in the classic coming-of-age film St. Elmo's Fire that same year in 1985. Of course, the actors were Judd Nelson, Anthony Michael Hall, Ali Sheedy, and Emilio Estevez, and a few others as well. Movies like Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Some Kind of Wonderful would cement John Hughes as a creative force in directing and writing, and gave a voice to young adults and teenagers at the time. It captured the spirit of their plight growing up in the decade and how they dealt with the trappings of it as well. And soon, all of these movies and more could be watched on a VCR in the comfort of many homes in America, as VHS cassettes had become the dominant format. With the advent of video rental stores such as Blockbuster Video and Palmer Video, movie watching became an alternative to going to theaters. As for television, this is where things went a very different route. For most of the 80s, television was a mixed bag. In other words, variety was the spice of life. There would be many shows that came to airwaves that changed the TV landscape, such as Knight Rider, starring a young upstart actor by the name of David Hasselhoff as Michael Knight, working as an avenger for a benefactor to fight for justice after being given a second chance at life, under a new identity after being shot in the face. As much as Knight Rider made David Hasselhoff a household name, it would be his vehicle, Kit, a jet black Pontiac Trans Am that was decked out in advanced tech and even talk that was the true star here. Knight Rider was a huge hit on NBC, and CBS wanted in on the vehicle action as well. Airwolf would make its way to the network. This one was about a pilot in a very high-tech military helicopter taking on special missions. Speaking of the military, NBC would have another series that was a huge hit for them, The A-Team. 4 ex-Green Berets were on the run from the same government that they had fought for in Vietnam for a crime they didn't commit. These 4 were led by Hannibal Smith, played by George Peppard, who himself was a World War II Marine vet and starred in the classic 1959 war film Pork Chop Hill. But the breakout star of the group was B.A. Baracus, played by Mr. T. And it wasn't because of his awesome van that they rode in. This wouldn't be his only tenure on television. This was just the beginning. And you know what else was the beginning of something? The male lead action adventure dramas. For instance, ABC would premiere MacGyver, starring Richard Dean Anderson, as the titular character. His first name was Angus, by the way. MacGyver was a very different action hero, as he abhorred the use of guns. Instead, he used his intelligence and know-how to get out of any situation that he was in, all while working for a foundation that specialized in carrying on missions. Over on CBS, Peter Selleck would take the reins of an ex-Vietnam War vet as Magnum P.I., a private eye who roamed the streets of Oahu, Hawaii, with his best friends from his days in the military, TC and Rick, helping him out on cases. And guess what? This series was a huge hit on CBS. On the other side of the spectrum, NBC would also premiere Miami Vice. Created by Michael Mann, it would be a series that showcased a darker side of the 1980s, just as Scarface did in theaters. The high glamour and glitz and unadulterated decadence of 1980s Miami, but from the perspective of two pastel suit-wearing undercover detectives by the name of Crockett and Tubbs, played by Don Johnson and Philip Michael Thomas, respectively. These two weren't just some regular undercover cops. These two took on assignments that could have meant life or death, including dealing with key people of Miami's drug underworld. There hadn't been any show like Miami Vice on television up to that point. The show had depicted life in 80s Miami, such as the atmosphere and the sense of fashion that invoked the era. It changed television in terms of visual style, as it was shot and structured just like a film. The series would garner multiple Emmys during its 5-year run on NBC and made one artist one of the biggest musical icons of the 1980s. That man I speak of is none other than Phil Collins, and that song was In the Air Tonight. As for sitcoms, they started to take a very different direction than they did in the 70s. Gone were the racial overtones and innuendos of the 70s sitcoms. Instead, they started to lean on traditional family values, precocious teens, and tackling very serious issues with the use of a very special episode. NBC still had Different Strokes, which was a prime example of that, but the show would spawn a spin-off called The Facts of Life. In this series, the Drummonds' housekeeper was now a house mother, taking care of students at an all-girls school, the Eastland School for Girls to be precise. This one, alongside Different Strokes, would lead the pack in the 1980s for family-oriented morality sitcoms. Soon, sitcoms such as Punky Brewster followed suit. This one had a very young Soleil Moon Frye in the role of a precocious little girl who was abandoned by her mother and taken in by Mr. Warnemont. Punky gets into misadventures with her best friend and her dog as well. The sitcom leaned on its title character's warming personality and charm. Then the network had Gimme a Break with the late, great Nell Carter as a housekeeper to the Koninsky family after their mother dies. This was the new version of the blended family concept that had started early with the Brady Bunch. ABC had garnered some of their own on their lineup. For instance, they had Growing Pains, which was helmed by the man who sang the theme to Different Strokes himself. That man I speak of is Alan Thicke, of course. Here he is the patriarch of the Seaver family, and he is a psychiatrist, living with his wife Maggie, his kids Ben and Carol, and the breakout star that would become one of the biggest heartthrobs of the day, Mike Seaver. That, of course, being Kirk Cameron, getting into mischief and being cool about it. But it wasn't all fun and games. The Seaver clan also dealt with family issues as well. But the cream of the crop when it concerned sitcoms was on NBC. It showcased the working family to the fullest. Sitcoms such as Family Ties, which of course starred Michael J. Fox as Alex P. Keaton, a conservative teenager living with his parents who were a product of the 60s. In other words, liberals, or better yet, hippies. His sisters, Mallory and Jennifer, were along for the ride as the sitcom painted a true picture of family life in the 1980s. Michael J. Fox would go on to also make waves in one of the greatest movies of that decade, Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale's 1985 classic, Back to the Future, alongside a previous 70s sitcom alum, Christopher Lloyd. And then there was The Cosby Show. Here, Bill Cosby was back in a huge way. It had him playing the role of Cliff Huxtable, a doctor, and his wife, Claire, a lawyer, raising their kids in a Brooklyn brownstone. A sitcom that would not only blaze a trail for African Americans on television and restructured the image of a black family as a working middle-class family, but also became a huge hit on NBC. So much, it was a Nielsen Top 10 for 5 years straight at number 1. That was a rare feat for any show on television. So rare, it hadn't been done since All in the Family. On top of that, it would garner its own spinoff, A Different World, 3 years later, 1987 to be exact. That was the 80s, a true cornucopia of different genres that made television what it was, a true reflection of what was going on in America. As I always say, that was primetime television. So, what was the deal with Saturday morning programming at the top of the 1980s and so on? Well, truthfully, most of the successful cartoons that aired during the latter half of the 1970s, mainly from 1977 to 1979, had run into the new decade as either new episodic content or just repackaged as reruns. But also, a few new cartoons had made their way to the network's lineups as well. It seemed things were going well in the industry and with the networks. But as we know by now, this wasn't ever the case. In 1982, an event would rock the animation industry to its core. This is the 1980s, and our story continues on. The networks were becoming disenfranchised with Saturday morning programming altogether. With the constant reshuffling of shows and countless super-hour cartoon blocks, hit shows were becoming harder and harder to come by on the big three. On top of this, meeting demand also weighed heavily on the studios. This pushed them to start outsourcing, or what most animators at the time were calling it, runaway productions. Speaking of those animators, they weren't exactly pleased with the jobs done by animators overseas. Many animators had enough of it, making them do the unthinkable in 1982. They went on strike. To fully understand why they did, we must jump back to 1941. This year was quite important. This is the year that the Screen Cartoonist Guild would be established, a guild that would bring about change in the animation industry when many animators of the time banded together to challenge the work practices of their bosses. For instance, Leon Schlesinger was one of those bosses. You know, a man previously discussed on his channel, the head of Warner Brothers Animation Studio, aka Termite Terrace. Well, he tried to exclude anyone who sided with the guild from working in his studio. This didn't bode very well for him. Several animators would revolt, or what Chuck Jones once referred to it as the 6-Day War. And for good reason. That's how long it had taken Leon Schlesinger to give in to the guild's demands and sign on with them. With Warner Brothers, along with Screen Gems, MGM, and Walterland Studios, there was one studio that was the last holdout: Disney. The studio, mainly Walt Disney, didn't want to comply with the guild, as he felt that the animes in his studio should be happy that they were working for them. You have to remember, Disney around this time was the hottest commodity in Tinseltown. But Walt would soon learn that this wasn't a great move. The studio's top animator, Art Babbitt, resigned from his position as the studio's union president to join the guild. Yeah. This was the case as he banded with his fellow animators and they went on strike, which is now dubbed the Disney strike. As you can imagine, this was a huge blow. To have any downtime longer than a week in any production is a nightmare waiting to happen. This strike lasted for 5 weeks, more than a month. The studio greatly suffered from this. Walt had no choice but to give up. If you think that was bad, Terry Toons also tried the same stunt in 1947. Unsurprisingly, they lost that battle as well. And 8 months of productivity. Ouch. Fast forward to 1982. History had repeated itself because it was Disney animators once again out in the streets protesting. The Guild, which was now named the Motion Picture Screen Cartoonists Local 839 under IATSE, had banded together. And it wasn't just Disney animators out there. Hanna-Barbera staff and many others were out there in the picket line as well. Their grievances about losing their job protection had gotten to a boiling point. This was due to the studios wanting to free up their budget so they can hire overseas studios to do their animation. The strike lasted for 2 straight months, but unfortunately, the strike wasn't successful. See, many of the animators that were picketing had grown very weary of not making money. So many of them had given up on the fight and returned back to the studios. That was it. The studios had gotten their way. The reason for me mentioning all of this is after the strike, Runaway Productions would take off in a huge way. This would bring about the advent of syndicated animation. Mind you, animation for syndication wasn't a new concept, as Hanna-Barbera had gotten their start on television, making cartoons for the syndicated market, such as The Yogi Bear Show and Huckleberry Hound Show. But this time, it was different. This side of the animation space deserves an episode of its own. But for the context of this episode, many syndicated markets started to get animated offerings and even anime imports that were a far cry from the days of Astro Boy.
And the Masters of the Universe!
Case in point, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe would make its way to syndication in 1983. From Filmation. Yeah. I will delve into how the studio had gotten to this point soon enough. Anyway, the cartoon aired on weekday mornings and afternoons. Yes, 5 days a week. On top of that, it had become something that the networks had dreaded. A huge hit. They felt that they couldn't compete with that massive output. Think about it from this perspective. Why watch cartoons on Saturday that were only going to be canceled or repackaged on another network when kids could watch a cartoon they loved for 5 days a week, in the mornings and afternoons? Apparently, kids just loved cartoons and watched them all regardless. But the networks didn't think this way because the success of He-Man even garnered a massive merchandise rollout, considering the cartoon was made to sell toys to begin with, a practice that ruled a great majority of the 1980s. It didn't help by this point, many in the business had started to loathe making Saturday morning programming. Filmation's successful venture led to the birth of many other studios that wanted to take advantage of the revised syndicated market. So how most of these studios were going to get that much product out on airwaves? You should know the answer by now. The networks had more trouble to contend with besides the rise of syndication. They had to deal with the ACT with their constant crusade against advertisers, which was the network's bread and butter. The watchdog groups were still on their tail as usual, but a new thorn in their side had emerged. The AFA, the American Family Association. Now, if you thought the ACT and the watchdog groups were vicious, they were pale in comparison to the AFA. Originally founded by a Methodist minister by the name of Doug E. Wildman in 1977, under the name of the National Federation of Decency, the AFA was on a relenting crusade against anything they deemed indecent on television. Considering this was a group led by a religious leader, you can imagine what measures they had taken to get their point across. They imposed campaigns on networks to change the content of their shows with extreme measures. Now, they were bringing their crusade to Saturday morning programming, which was quite absurd itself considering that the networks were already airing cartoons that were inoffensive and void of any kind of violence. This was all in part of the duties carried out by the BS&P, Broadcast Standards and Practices, by the way. They were basically a department that resided in every network that governed content that could be seen or said on television. A department that was founded after the 1950s quiz show scandals. At the top of the 80s, they had become more aggressive. To a point, they were even telling writers what they could or couldn't put in their scripts. To circumvent this problem, many creators started to turn their work in very late so the networks couldn't change anything at the last minute. It had gotten this bad, and a cloud of pure discontent started to lord over Saturday morning programming. Speaking of this, we have finally arrived at the most important question. What did the networks have to offer the children of America during the latter half of the 1980s? Well, let's take a look at CBS. At the start of the decade, the network had a new man at the helm for Saturday morning programming, Bud Grant, a man who was quite meticulous about how he ran things. He was the one responsible for reconstructing CBS's daytime lineup by distancing the network away from the reruns and instead placing more game shows in those time slots. So it's easy to suffice that Bud's laser-sharp focus on daytime programming would be the key to the network's success going forward. So, how did Bud approach Saturday morning programming? Well, truthfully, he didn't have to really do too much since most of the network's offerings had bled into the new decade. For instance, staples such as Looney Tunes were still on the lineup. Here it was known as the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner Show. Even Popeye managed to show up on the lineup as well. And then there was Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, a cartoon that had been a great success for CBS, and their partnership with Filmation had remained intact. Tarzan would be on its third season, but he wouldn't go at it alone. This time, he had the Lone Ranger joining him on the lineup. Yes, that Lone Ranger. That masked rider was at it again. Now it was the Tarzan Lone Ranger Adventure Hour. But this wasn't the Lone Ranger and Tonto's first rodeo. They had previously gone on animated adventures in 1966 for one season, comprising 11-minute segments. He would once again show up in an episode of The Brady Kids as well. Filmation and CBS banked on this once prestigious hero to bring them good ratings. In this outing, Filmation would employ the services of William Conrad to voice the Lone Ranger. He was quite known at this time for his stint on shows such as Cannon and Jake and the Fat Man. In addition, he was the announcer for the Bullwinkle Show, but he would go under the name W. Darnock. since it was frowned upon for most actors to do cartoons at the time. As for the New Adventures of Lone Ranger, liberties were taken due to the strict stance of CBS's Standards and Practices Department. No more shooting up bad guys. That was out of the picture. Instead, the Lone Ranger managed to shoot his gun to knock his adversaries' weapons from their hands or used a trick shot to get the job done. Also, in true fashion, the series managed to dispense some educational tidbits and interacted with historical figures of the time such as Ulysses S. Grant. So, how did the New Adventures of Lone Ranger fare on Saturday mornings? Well, the pairing had proven to be the right move as it got an additional 16 11-minute segments the following season, which brought the series to a total of 32 episodes. Regarding that second season, Filmation added another offering to the package. A certain masked hero of literature would make its way to television in grand fashion.
Afraid. But with a mask as my disguise, I ride into the night and raise my sword in the name of justice. For I am Zorro!
Lo and behold, the masked sword-wielding hero himself in the New Adventures of Zorro. This is a series that was created at the height of Filmation's run as they were on a roll. In addition to making The Lone Ranger and He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, they also managed to squeeze out new episodes of Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, which also went into syndication in 1985. So it's easy to suffice that they were very swamped with projects, but they still managed to utilize all they had learned in previous productions. But not for this outing. See, many at the studio couldn't carry a load of making another cartoon series. So Filmation did the unthinkable. They outsourced the project and to Tokyo Movie Shinsha. Yes, TMS, a studio that was known for creating anime classics such as Space Adventure Cobra and Lupin III. Now they were on the job for the first time to show their prowess, and unsurprisingly, they did just that. The series would look very drastically different from what Filmation had done before, with the use of rotoscoping provided by one of the staffers who was heavily into fencing for the fight scenes, and the talent at TMS. Zorro offered a fresh take on the hero cartoon. As for the premise itself, it had Don Diego and his companion just going about their day until danger reared its head in the form of the Conquistadors. Don Diego and his companion became Zorro and Amigo, which is Spanish for a friend, by the way. Speaking of Spanish, it would be the first anime series to feature an all-Hispanic cast. On top of that, Zorro was voiced by Henry Darrow, who is no stranger to the role as he played the character in a live TV adaptation years prior. But he would be mostly known for his role as Manolito Montoya in the 1967 TV Western series, The High Chaparral, made by the same man who created Bonanza. Despite all of the effort and meticulous detail put into the series, The New Adventures of Zorro only lasted for 13 episodes as a part of the Tarzan Lone Ranger Zorro Adventure Hour. Speaking of massive output, Filmation released another one for the network, another series that displayed their prowess. This one would take the kids of America to a place far, far away.
This is his destiny. I am John Blackstar.
Here it is, Filmation's otherworldly adventure, starring the titular character, John Blackstar, an astronaut who's whisked away into a black hole and becomes stranded on an alien planet, a planet inhabited by the pint-sized and good-natured Trobits. Joined by a sorceress named Mara, the heroic shapeshifter Clone, and his dragon-like steed Warlock, Blackstar defended the planet from the evil warlord and his minions with one half of the Star Sword. Since CBS was the home of Filmation's productions, they wanted to add a series that could compete with another studio's effort. That studio was Ruby Spears Productions, and that cartoon was Thundar the Barbarian, which aired on ABC a year prior. It reinvigorated the fantasy genre into the animation space, so Filmation had to take a stab at it. Initially, the title character was supposed to be an African American, hence the name Blackstar. But CBS didn't think it would resonate with the audience at home and become a success. On top of that, their previous creation, Micro Woman and Super Stretch, had sparked some controversy of its own, with DC wanting to sue them for copyright infringement. This would have been a risk in itself, banking on that original idea. It's just a theory, of course, but nevertheless, Blackstar wasn't a huge hit for CBS, unfortunately. With 13 episodes ever produced, the series came and went, but this wasn't really the end for the series, as it had taken a new life in syndication. Even though it didn't run very long in syndication, it did catch the attention of Mattel. And as they say, the rest is history. CBS would conjure up another offering for the lineup, something that had warmed the hearts of millions who watched it, an American classic that was finally brought to a place where it belonged, Saturday mornings. So, what was this classic that I'm speaking of? Well, it's best if you see for yourself. Lo and behold, the weekly and Sunday comic strip classic that had entertained millions in newspapers across the country. Peanuts. But here in 1983, their debut in the Saturday morning cartoon animation space would be known as The Charlie Brown and Snoopy Show. What is there to say about Charlie Brown and his friends? Well, for one, they were the creation of Charles M. Schulz. But when it came to the animation space, Schulz had partnered with two men who wanted to bring these characters to a television screen. These two men were Bill Melendez and Lee Mendelsohn. See, it all started out as an unfinished documentary that they were doing about Schulz, but no one didn't want to bank on it. An ad agency by the name of McCann Erickson had stumbled upon a Time magazine cover that Charlie Brown was on. They reached out to Mendelsohn and wanted to work with him. So Mendelsohn had mentioned that he and Melendez were working on a full-length cartoon with Schulz, which was a lie. At first, because this idea had soon became a reality as Schulz, Mendelsohn, and Melendez banded together and formed their own production company. The project they finally finished reared its head in 1965 as A Charlie Brown Christmas. CBS didn't believe it was going to be a hit and wanted to shelve it due to the lack of faith in finding an audience, including Fred Silverman himself. Luckily, Schulz, Mendelsohn, and Melendez had proven them wrong, because on that night of December 9th, 1965, A Charlie Brown Christmas had become an instant hit. It had proven to be so successful it would win an Emmy for Outstanding Children's Programming the following year. So, of course, the train had rolled for more content with Charlie Brown and the gang, and soon it did, with many specials such as. But in 1969, Melendez-Mendelsohn Productions would take Charlie Brown to a place that he hadn't explored yet: movie theaters. With A Boy Named Charlie Brown, on December 4th, 1969. This one had Charlie Brown entering the spelling bee, and upon winning, Charlie Brown takes a trip to New York City to attend the National Spelling Bee. The film ended up becoming a tremendous success, a film that was made with a $1.1 million budget, which was quite a lot by 1960 standards, and ended up earning $12 million at the box office. Mind you, this was mostly unheard of outside of anything related Disney, but Melendez-Mendelsohn Productions managed to pull it off easily. This would be the beginning of their newfound success, which finally brings us to the Charlie Brown and Snoopy Show, a show that unfortunately came to television after the dismal success of 1980's Bon Voyage Charlie Brown. So what did the studio bring to CBS's Saturday morning lineup 3 years later, in 1983? Well, for one, it continued to showcase the trials and tribulations of a lovable average Joe, Charlie Brown, a kid who wasn't the best at everything and was often pushed around, but he always managed to persevere in the end. That was the basis of the series. The Charlie Brown and Snoopy Show was quite similar to the specials, but this time Schultz insisted that the comic strips were used as stories for the series. So in other words, this was Peanuts in its truest form, brought to Saturday mornings. Charlie was accompanied by the cast of characters from the comic strips and specials, such as Snoopy, his lovable dog and resident Joe Cool, Woodstock, the neighborhood yellow canary that was Snoopy's best friend, Schroeder, Charlie's best friend, and a budding pianist that had a pure passion for Beethoven's music.
You blew it, kid.
Peppermint Patty, who had a bipolar affection for Charlie and always called him Chuck.
The answer is true. Put down true, Chuck. What's true is true. Put down true, Chuck, or I'll never speak to you again.
Marcy, her best friend, who was quite intelligent and had a crush on Charlie Brown and always called Patty Sir. Linus, the kid who managed to go everywhere with his favorite blanket. And he was also a little brother to Lucy. Yeah, Lucy Van Pelt, the bane of Charlie Brown's existence. Schroeder's thorn in his rear, was bossy and had an innate skill of antagonizing everyone around her.
Innocence in my eyes. She's right. If a girl has innocent-looking eyes, you simply have to trust her. This time, I'm gonna kick that football clear to the moon.
Yeah, she still does that in the series. It was definitely like the comic strips. Oh, Lucy. Then you had Sally, Charlie's precocious little sister, and Enola, a charming little girl who always managed to wrestle Linus's blanket away from him with her charm. That's girls for you. The series was presented in short segments that told a small piece of the story that oddly connected in some way and managed to showcase every character in them. The Charlie Brown and Snoopy Show was a sizable hit, and it could have been more. See, the studio and CBS decided to put the show on hiatus for some odd reason. The show ended up coming back for a second season for only 5 episodes, and that was it. Well, at least for Saturday mornings. As most know by now, Charlie and the gang went on to have many more specials. Today they can be seen on Apple's streaming service. So don't worry, Charlie is still out there, trying to strive on and finally trying to kick that football. Darn Lucy. CBS was on the road in 1983 and so on. They were keeping up with the high demand for supplying content that engaged their young audience, offering such as Biscuits, which unfortunately was quite short-lived on the network, Meatballs and Spaghetti, and even an anime series based on the Dukes of Hazzard managed to make its way to the lineup. an insurance policy that was commonplace around this time. ABC had Fonz and Laverne and Shirley as anime offerings on ABC a year prior. Of course, these were usually meant to fill lines as they had done years before. The networks also weren't exactly done with the super hours as well. In fact, CBS would bring one that redefined the concept, a Saturday morning take on a hobby that was becoming quite the pastime.
We'll get your video friends together. Yes, Saturday Supercade is time for fun, and no one else can do it better. And it feels so right because it's Supercade time. Let's have some Supercade fun. Yes, it's Supercade time. Let's have some Supercade fun. Come on to Supercade time. Join all the Supercade fun.
Here it is, CBS's valiant effort to recapture their young audience in a special way. Their totally different approach to the Super Hour cartoon block. Saturday Supercade, a cartoon series based on characters and their respective intellectual properties that enamored kids in arcades and in living rooms across America. Of course, I speak of video games. By 1982, the video game business had blossomed to amass close to $12 billion in revenue. Gaming consoles such as the ColecoVision, Intellivision, and of course, the champ at the time, the Atari 2600, were the talk in playgrounds across the country. So it was only befitting that they became more than just electronic entertainment. Unsurprisingly, Hanna-Barbera would actually beat everyone to the punch with Pac-Man on ABC in 1982. So it seemed everything was on good terms. And it was, until 1983. See, for those who don't know what happened in 1983, let me enlighten you. This is the year that the gaming industry suffered a huge blow. I speak of none other than the video game crash of 1983. Around this time, the market had become so saturated with many game releases, many had started to lose interest due to low-quality games that were being pushed out to stores across the country. It had gotten to a point where stores were so overstocked with them, they had to try to sell them off at very low discounted prices. This made Atari do the unthinkable. They dumped many of their cartridges into a landfill in New Mexico to get rid of them. They were hit badly, losing $310 million that year because of it. This had to be mentioned for only one thing. Saturday Supercade premiered on September 17, 1983. Yes, during the video game crash. But these characters were in good hands because the studio behind it was none other than Ruby Spears Enterprises, as they would be known by now. As you may know, Ruby Spears and Hanna-Barbera were close relatives to one another. That was just the nature of the business. Anyway, Saturday Supercade showcased interpretations of the popular games of that era, such as Pitfall, Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Frogger, to name a few. As in Saturday morning fashion, Ruby Spears played very loose with these adaptations. For instance, Frogger had the titular character as a news reporter working for the Swamp Gazette newspaper for an overbearing boss by the name of Tex Toadwalker. That dynamic sounds oddly familiar, doesn't it? We'll get to that one very soon. Anyway, he was joined by Fanny and Shelley Turtle as they tried to get to school, while not getting crushed on the road. Don't worry, this was a Saturday morning cartoon. There was an air pump in tow to revive him. Gotta love Saturday morning cartoons, right? Then you had Donkey Kong, who was smart enough to try to remain free after escaping from a circus. Tasked with capturing and bringing him back were Mario and his trainer Pauline. For anyone who played Donkey Kong in arcades, certainly knew this animated take was totally opposite from the source material. If he thought that was opposite from the source material, then Donkey Kong Jr. had it beat, as it had Donkey Kong Jr. and his human companion Bones going off to find Donkey Kong, who had escaped from the circus, but they would always miss his trail. And if that was odd, then Q*bert was even odder than that. This one had Q*bert as a high schooler, living in the town of Q*burg, and hanging out with his girlfriend Cutie, his brother Q*bit, and his always hungry friend Q*ball. He had to contend with the likes of Coily, Ugg, Wrongway, and Viper. Besides Q*bert being a knockoff of Happy Days, Q*bert had arms. Truly bizarre. But these inaccurate representations of these video game characters didn't matter to kids in America, because the series was a success for the network. Enough success to garner a second season. Unfortunately, this season would omit Frogger, Pitfall, and Donkey Kong Jr. from their roster, and replace them with Kangaroo and Space Ace. Ruby Spears Enterprises were beginning to get on the ball around this time. Their biggest success was around the corner on another network. We'll get to that soon enough. As for Saturday Supercade, it was the beginning of video games' presence on Saturday mornings. What was to come would capitalize off the medium in a huge way, but that doesn't come until later in the decade. But for 1984, these characters became a way for kids to have fun when their consoles were off. That definitely stands for something.
That's better.
The network had upped the ante by bringing something special to the lineup that would usher in a subgenre of cartoons, from the mind of the man who reshaped children's entertainment as a whole and reinvented the primetime variety show. So what was this special cartoon that CBS decided to debut on this Saturday morning lineup? Without further ado, here it is, the late Jim Henson's reinvention of his Muppet characters shot to overnight success with The Muppet Show. As mentioned, in the history of Hanna-Barbera Part 3, the idea of Muppet Babies is actually based on a scene in The Muppets Take Manhattan. And in that scene, Miss Piggy has a musical flashback sequence of them when they were babies growing up in the nursery. This in turn caught the eye of Margaret Loesch, who was newly appointed CEO and president of Marvel Productions after David H. DePatie left the position. But Bob Richardson and Jeffrey Scott really shouldered the duty of bringing Muppet Babies to fruition. At first, Bob thought it would be a disaster, but he and Jeffrey had no choice but to bank on the concept. This was due in part to Jim Henson choosing to work with them upon having a meeting with them. Jim Henson believed in that scene from Muppets Take Manhattan. It was something they had to carry on. This was definitely for a good reason, considering that The Muppets Take Manhattan was a huge box office success, earning $25.5 million. As for Marvel Productions, the studio was already on a roll around this time with the syndicated success of Transformers and G.I. Joe. So, did they manage to strike gold again? More on that shortly. As for Muppet Babies, the premise takes from that scene in the movie and expands upon it. They are babies growing up in a nursery, ran by Nanny. The green and white striped sock-wearing caretaker was never seen past her legs. But she should still sound familiar to many at the time, as she was voiced by none other than the late Barbara Billingsley, one of the greatest TV moms of all time, with a role as June Cleaver in the classic 1957 sitcom Leave It to Beaver. Now, she was lending her soft vocal delivery to Saturday mornings. But the stars of the show were the Muppets, of course. First, we have Kermit the Frog, who is basically the straight man. Frog, and the voice of reason. Unofficially the leader of the babies. Then we had Rolf, who loved to play music on his piano. So skilled, he could give Schroeder a run for his money and belt a tune with the best of them. Next, we have Fozzie Bear, who was always quick to tell a joke. Very bad jokes. So bad, it often got him pelted with tomatoes.
Wow! Something tells me I ought to give up comedy and go into the tomato sauce business.
Scooter, who is the genius of the group, a computer wizard, and his sister Skeeter, who was created specifically for the series and was quite the athletic. Then you had Miss Piggy, who was just as she was in the films, bossy, a love interest of Kermit, and dreams to be the center of attention. Then you had Gonzo, a self-proclaimed and all-around weirdo who had a love for weirdness, and his stuffed chicken Camilla. And lastly, Animal, who was as his name implied. In other words, wild and crazy, always quick to cause the most ruckus, but he was Gonzo's best friend, so that stood for something. As they say, two birds of a feather flock together. The series employed the use of stock footage as backgrounds and black and white B-rolls as the babies used their imagination to whisk them off to different places, in which Jim Henson himself was adamant about making them the series' primary focus. As for the animation itself, Marvel Productions didn't handle the series by themselves. They would also be joined by a studio that had quite the prestige at the time. That studio was none other than Toei Animation Company, a studio that had made its mark already with anime such as Dr. Slump, Dragon Ball, and Hokuto no Ken, but also on American shores with Beast King Go Lion and Armor Fleet Die Rugger. Both of them were heavily edited and translated to make Voltron. With Toei handling most of the animation duties alongside Marvel Productions, Muppet Babies became a huge success on the network. So much of a success, it garnered an Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program for 3 years straight. Yeah. So it's safe to say that Muppet Babies wasn't going anywhere, and that was the case. During its run on CBS, the network banked on its success, pushing other shows as a 90-minute block, including two that weren't much of a success. One of them was Little Muppet Monsters. This was a sort of spin-off to the Muppets that only lasted for 3 episodes. This was due to Jim Henson thinking that it wasn't up to his standard and quality, so he requested it to be canceled. On top of that, it had gotten hard for Marvel Productions to even produce those 3 initial episodes due to the difficulty in integrating and producing the animation segments for the series. In its place, they just reran Muppet Babies in its time slot. This was a nail in the coffin for Little Muppet Monsters, as it never returned after that. The other was Garbage Pail Kids, a cartoon deemed so offensive, it even made the ACT apply pressure on CBS to cancel it. This left the network to just double down on Muppet Babies. During its run, Marvel Productions ceased its partnership with Toei Animation and went with Korean-based Acom Productions instead. In all, Muppet Babies lasted for the entire 80s, with 7 seasons in total. Most importantly, these babies made their mark on Saturday mornings that will be long remembered, making their imaginations real for us to revel in again and again.
Go, baby!
CBS had another offering with Marvel Productions at the helm. This one was another insurance policy, an animated take on a classic game. The network would bring kids to another world to experience a quest like no other.
Dragon's Ride! Wow, neat!
Give me a break.
I don't like this!
Whoa! What's happening?
Whoa!
Here it is, the animated adaptation of one of the most important games ever made. The game that revolutionized the RPG genre, Dungeons and Dragons. A game that had a slew of fans going on a quest with a gathering of friends. A game that would ultimately inspire many game creators to bring that same level of experience to televisions via gaming consoles and personal computers. Games such as the Ultimate series, the Dragon Quest series, the Final Fantasy series, and many more. Dungeons and Dragons, or D&D as it is commonly known as, also had its fair share of controversy, including the game being blamed for the untimely suicide of 19-year-old James Dallas Egbert III, who once disappeared off the campus of Michigan State University. He had taken his life from a self-inflicted gunshot to the head. Many friends had said he was a fan of the game. Another incident in 1982 involving Irving Lee Pulling shooting himself in the chest was blamed on D&D and led his mother on a crusade and create an organization called BAD, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, in order to have the game banned. Many Christian advocacy groups across the country claimed the game promoted devil worship, racism, etc. Dungeons and Dragons was public enemy number one. So, with all this backlash and controversy, how did something like Dungeons and Dragons make its way to television in the first place? Well, it was brought to television under the supervision of the game's creators, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. On top of that, the series was created by none other than Marvel Productions in partnership with Toei Animation. Takashi Matsunaga would serve as art director and model designer. Takashi had done work on Muppet Babies, but he would be mostly known for his work on the classic 1973 animated film Charlotte's Web. So if anyone could bring the world of D&D to life with fluid animation, it was him. And he did just that. Dungeons and Dragons would be highly regarded at the time for its animation style that differed from any Saturday morning cartoon before it. As for the premise of the series, it starred 6 kids who attended a theme park and they go on the Dungeons and Dragons roller coaster ride. But this wouldn't be just any ordinary ride. They were instantly transported to another realm against their will, and they have to navigate this unknown land. With the guidance of a mysterious old magician by the name of Dungeon Master, they are on a quest to find their way back to their own realm. Just like the game itself, Dungeon Master assigns them roles that grant them special abilities. First, we have Hank, the archer and self-appointed leader of the group. Diana, the acrobat who used the staff. Sheila, the thief who warded off foes with the use of her invincibility cloak. Bobby, her younger brother. He was the barbarian of the group and wielded a powerful and magical club that he used to knock foes off their feet. Eric, the cavalier, the spoiled rich kid, the butt of everyone's jokes, but wielded a cool shield for protection. And Presto, a nerdy kid with a magical hat that could conjure anything when he pulled something out of it. Rounding out the cast was a Saturday morning cartoon staple. In other words, the animal companion. Here, it was a kid unicorn by the name of Uni. Together, they fought against the evil forces of Venger, a dark wizard who sought to capture all of their weapons and use them to rule over the realm once and for all. Due to the lack of actual violence, the series had leaned mostly on the strength of its storytelling, as it partially drew from the lore of the games, but also set out to create something entirely different from the game's mythology. Writers such as Jeffrey Scott, who wrote several episodes of Super Friends, Michael Reeves, and Mark Evanier, who wrote the pilot for the series and had written for Thundar the Barbarian. Mark would go on to help create another cartoon series that became a huge hit on CBS. I will get to that one soon enough. Dungeons & Dragons was another hit for CBS and Marvel Productions, as it garnered 2 additional seasons. The series actually got canceled toward the end of the 3rd season, with 1 episode that was left unaired. In all, Dungeons & Dragons had taken CBS to a new plateau. Over the horizon, bigger things were set to come for the network, but in 1983, kids got to go on a fantastical adventure most will never forget and left a mark on Saturday mornings. Guess that was the true magic of D&D.
Deep.
We will return after these messages.
Papa Smurf! Gargamel's stolen all of our food, and I'm so hungry I could eat a house! I'll make something smurfalicious.
What's Smurfy magic? Look, new Smurf pasta from Chef Boyardee.
It's Smurfy good for you. There's even Papa Smurf's special sauce.
Wow, Smurfy shapes too.
Ooh, that's out-smurfed again. Thank goodness for Chef Boyardee. It's Smurfy good.
Introducing Drive and Play.
Go into the store and you drive and play. Picking up stuff and you drive and play. Stopping for gas and you drive and play. All around Drive and Play Village.
With Drive and Play, you can really control the car by shifting forward and backward, even steering left and right. Your parents put it together, batteries not included.
All around Drive and Play Village.
Drive and Play comes with everything you see here, new from Child Guidance.
Are you ready? Because once you bite into a Three Musketeers bar, there's no turning back. It's so light it lifts you to the limit in chocolate taste, with the scented lips like a chocolate cloud, and coated in velvet smooth chocolate. Go on, lighten up with Three Musketeers, and let your spirits soar.
I gotta feel the taste, gotta make it right. Gotta taste it now, gotta get pumped, yeah, gotta get pumped.
The pop sensation of Kellogg's Corn Pop cereal, part of this nutritious breakfast.
I gotta get pumped, yeah, gotta get pumped.
Never before in this galaxy, free Starbots. Star travelers you transform and put together. One free in Corn Pops. Now, back to our story.
While CBS were off to a great start in the earlier part of the 80s, one network had a different approach to Saturday mornings. I speak of ABC. With Fred Silverman gone from ABC, this was a huge blow to the network, considering he was the man who brought Scooby-Doo to ABC in the first place. Luckily, Scooby-Doo would remain on the network's lineup. Now, it would be with Scrappy-Doo with the Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo show. But they wouldn't go at it alone. Once again, the Super Hour cartoon block was back with Richie Rich alongside them as the Richie Rich Scooby-Doo show. An insurance policy from the pages of Harvey Comics, no less. The misadventures of a rich kid and his pet dog Dollar. Even though Richie Rich was a good pairing with Scooby-Doo, it wasn't the hit that the network wanted it to be. Despite that, it did get 41 episodes in total, so that stands for something. The network would mostly have offerings that bled into the new decade, such as Plastic Man and Super Friends, which was just coming off its previous iteration, The World's Greatest Super Friends. Here, our superheroes were surprisingly still at it with more adventures. The network would also see Ruby Spears Productions come into their own. Out of the shadow of Hanna-Barbera, despite helping them with animation duties on several episodes of Scooby-Doo, they would bring something great to the network. Their next offering for the network would be Thundarr the Barbarian. This one would come off the success of Fangface and Plastic Man. Despite it seemingly being a product of the fantasy genre, the cartoon actually leaned toward the sci-fi genre. This was within good reason. See, the series was created by none other than Steve Gerber, a man who was quite successful in another medium at the time, comic books, particularly Marvel Comics. He would be known for creating Howard the Duck in 1973 and reinventing Man-Thing and Daredevil. His wealth of experience had lent itself to the series itself. Speaking of comics, he also collaborated with a man who was quite familiar with animation and comics itself. That man was none other than Alex Toth. Not only that, he also brought on Jack Kirby himself to design the backgrounds for the series. As for the premise, Thundarr the Barbarian took place on Earth ravaged by a moon that caused the planet to suffer systemic damage and destructive floods in the year of 1994. 2,000 years later, mankind is reeling to survive in this world, and one man must fight the evil forces of wizards that are terrorizing what's left of humanity. Joined by Ookla, a beast humanoid, and Princess Ariel. No, not that Ariel. Even though she would make her appearance in theaters in 1989. No, this Ariel, a budding sorceress who just happened to be the stepdaughter of the dastardly wizard Sabian. She frees Thundarr from captivity and he ends up wielding the Sun Sword, a mighty magical sword that reflected magic, all to protect the people of New Earth from Sabian and his wizard minions. Thundarr the Barbarian would also borrow heavily from another intellectual property that was making its comeback to theaters that year. I speak of none other than Star Wars, of course. Supposedly, ABC didn't want the show on the network, but with Gerber and Mark Evanier, who of course would go on to work on the aforementioned Dungeons & Dragons cartoon on CBS, to bring in said Jack Kirby alongside Ruby Spears to convince them to give the show a chance. ABC were proven wrong in their faith in the series. Thundarr the Barbarian was a hit for the network, but it still rubbed ABC the wrong way as they just couldn't buy into it, and they didn't greenlit a third season. Despite how unfortunate Thundarr the Barbarian's demise from the network lineup turned out, it would become the blueprint for every action cartoon series going forward into the 1980s. Not bad for a barbarian.
Ariel, Ookla, ride!
Ruby Spears Productions weren't out of content for the lineup. They were just getting the ball rolling. Their next offering for ABC's Saturday morning lineup had brought an actual comic to animation. Well, a comic strip to be exact. So, what was this interesting offering? Well, let's take a look at
Who's the sassiest, brassiest, classiest cat?
Heathcliff!
Who's got charm? Who's got warmth? Who's got style? You can bet he'll never get caught in the dog catcher's net.
Heathcliff!
Who's light on his feet, a whiz at disguise, who'll steal a mackerel right under your eyes?
Heathcliff!
Here come his friends, a trio of creeps. Dingbat,
Blah, blah!
the vampire dog, Spare-Rib the skeleton, and that jack-o'-lantern of all trades, Nobody. It's the Heathcliff and Dingbat Show.
Here it is. McNaughts, syndicates, troublesome feline leapt off the comic strips and onto television screens for a young audience. The one and only Heathcliff. Terrorizing neighborhoods. More on that later. This comes from the talented pen of George Gately, who created the character that made its premiere in comic strips in 1973. Heathcliff was your run-of-the-mill cat living in the town of West Finster. Well, if run-of-the-mill consisted of causing grief for everyone he encountered, including the milkman, and getting into random fights with dogs. Yes, that was Heathcliff in a nutshell. And Ruby Spears Enterprises brought him to Saturday morning in all of its glory. Of course, as the intro shows, he wasn't at it alone. Heathcliff was joined by Dingbat, a vampire dog who turned into a bat and dabbled in comedic hijinks alongside his chaps, the Creeps. A chubby skeleton in suspenders and a plunger on his head by the name of Spare Rib, and a walking, talking pumpkinhead that was filled with goodies by the name of Nobody. This trio got into antics while trying to work odd jobs for the sake of it. What do you expect? It's a cartoon. Heathcliff and Dingbat ended up becoming a sizable hit for ABC's Saturday morning lineup, at least to grant it a second season on the network. But this second season was quite different, as Dingbat and his crew were gone. In their place was Marmaduke, Ruby Spears' partnership with United Features Syndicate, a large Great Dane, but unlike Scooby-Doo, here it was a family dog to the Winslows. No, not this Winslow family. This one. The same as it was in the comic strips. Ruby Spears decided to make Marmaduke mostly the main attraction, with Heathcliff appearing in fewer segments as the titular feline only had one segment per episode. But this change wouldn't pan out for Ruby Spears as it was canceled after that second season. It seemed that this was it for Heathcliff. On Saturday mornings, that is. Remember I mentioned a wonderful feline terrorizing neighborhoods?
Heathcliff, Heathcliff, no one should terrify their neighborhood.
Well, that was his goal when it came to its return courtesy of DEMISE Enterprises in 1984 with an animated series in syndication by the name of Heathcliff and the Cadillac Cats. But it was most commonly known as just Heathcliff. Even then, this wouldn't be the last time an orange feline would grace Saturday mornings. Notice I said A. It's for a good reason, as we will see later on. But for 1982, Heathcliff had caused enough ruckus to pave the way for comic strips transitioning to Saturday morning stars.
Oh, this ain't a cartoon. This is heaven.
Hanna-Barbera was up to their usual around this time, of course. For ABC, the studio was used to capitalize off their former successes of their primetime sitcoms. In other words, to salvage what was left of the intellectual properties. Hanna-Barbera brought an anime offering of Laverne and Shirley and Mork and Mindy. The studio had found some success with Fonz and Happy Days Gang previously, and now they were trying their luck again with these two offerings, considering they were both spin-offs of Happy Days in the first place. Laverne and Shirley Go to the Army was based on the premise from an episode of the series, where they mistakenly enrolled into the military. Here, they are full-fledged recruits getting into various trouble and hijinks. If that's a sight for sore eyes, well, Mork and Mindy had them attending high school. These two series weren't particularly successful on the lineup. They would become nevertheless, but with the Fonz added alongside them. This was a bold move considering that the Happy Days Gang was just a one-season affair itself. But this was what ABC had wanted for their lineup. And Hanna-Barbera, with their machine-like approach to animation, was much obliged to meet their demands. Unfortunately, they would never become Saturday morning staples. But Hanna-Barbera did have a particularly strong ace up their sleeves for ABC's Saturday morning lineup. Something they were banking on to engage the young audience with ease. A cartoon based on a character that would soon become a household name. an icon. Without further ado, Hanna-Barbera presented them with this.
Pac-Man.
That's me.
Pac-Man. Oh! I must have those power pellets! Go find me the power pellet bonus!
That's right, in all of his glory. Pac-Man. A character that had many kids hanging out in arcades for hours, all to aid his chase of power pellets. 240 to be exact, as he is chased by 4 colored ghosts through a maze for 56 levels. The creation of Pac-Man came from the mind of Toru Iwatani, a man with passion and a wealth of experience even in his early years. Joining the Nakamura Manufacturing Company in 1977, which would later be renamed Namco, Toru had a goal in mind, and that was to initially create pinball machines. But there was a slight problem with that. Namco wasn't in the business of making pinball machines, but Toru didn't let that deter his vision. Instead, he went on to create a game for the company called GB. This game combined his love for pinball machines and met Namco's quota. GB was a mashup of Pong, which of course was the grandfather of video game design, and Breakout, a game which Namco had found success with previously. Unfortunately, GB wasn't the success that Namco had wanted, considering only a very few vendors had purchased cabinets for their arcades. The big game at the time would be 1978's title arcade classic, Space Invaders. Soon, every company under the sun was trying to emulate the success of Space Invaders with knockoffs. But Namco and Toru Iwatani had something else in mind. Toru's next idea would actually be inspired by the chase antics of Tom and Jerry, Casper the Friendly Ghost, and Kotaro the Ghost, particularly Kotaro because he was a ghost who loved to eat a lot. In short, Toru's new creation would make its way to Japanese arcades on July of 1980 as Pac-Man. The game didn't end up being a huge success in Japan like Namco had wanted, so a worldwide release was around the corner as it came to the States in September of that year, in partnership with Bally Midway. The name was changed to Pac-Man for obvious reasons. Hint: Puck rhymes with a rather unsavory word. Definitely bad for business for stateside release. Considering the game was designed to attract a female audience and kids alike, nothing couldn't get in the way of this game being a success. And that's what happened. The game flooded arcades across the country. Soon it had reached pop status. It even inspired a hit record. Pac-Man was riding high and he would get the ultimate honor, being on the Atari 2600. The game ended up becoming a huge success. So huge, it had sold 7.7 million copies, which in itself was quite unheard of around this time, even back in the early 70s. Now, it was time for Pac-Man to dominate television screens in another way. Things had come full circle because it was a cartoon made by the same studio ran by 2 men that made the cartoon that inspired Toru's game in the first place. Of course, I speak of Hanna-Barbera. Their take on the game would be quite different as Pac-Man was now a family man, husband to Miss Pac-Man, now named Pepper, who made her debut in 1982 with her own game of the same name, and father to Pac-Baby, who also made his debut in arcades in 1982 as well. And of course, being a Saturday morning cartoon, 2 animal companions rounded out the family, Pac-Dog and Sourpuss. They all had to contend with the likes of the same ghosts that appeared in the game, Blinky, Pinky, Inky, and Clyde, along with Sue, an added ghost made just for the series to give our pellet-eating hero more trouble than he needed. and keeping the other ghosts in check with her feminine wiles, of course, who all sported a different look from their video game counterparts. They were all led by a new character created just for the anime series, a villain by the name of Mesmeron. His dastardly mission was to take all the power pellets for himself, but not on Pac-Man's watch, as he was tasked to protect Power Pellet Forest and help keep Pac-Land safe. Pac-Man actually made his premiere on a super block housing Richie Rich and the Little Rascals. Yes, the same kids who were at the birth of Saturday morning programming were now in anime adventures for the first time. But it was Pac-Man that was the talk of the town. Pac-Man fever was at an all-time high at this point. In other words, the series was a huge hit for ABC's Saturday morning lineup. On top of that, Namco released an official sequel to the hit arcade game called Super Pac-Man. In this outing, Pac-Man was looking more heroic than ever, sporting a cape. He was now tasked with eating keys to open doors so he could collect items to complete the level. That cape just wasn't for show. Pac-Man would actually fly over the ghosts by eating super pellets in the level to avoid them. They soon followed it up with Junior Pac-Man and Pac-and-Pal. With the first season being a success for the network, it was followed by a second season. This season decided to change things up a bit by adding 2 new characters. The first was Super Pac, which was clearly inspired by the Super Pac-Man arcade game. He came from another dimension from a portal to assist Pac-Man in his fight to maintain peace in Pac-Land. The second was PJ, Pac-Man's nephew who came to stay with them for the time being. It seemed that Pac-Man, the anime series, was poised for future success, but that wasn't the case. 2 seasons is all that it had gotten. That was the nature of Saturday morning programming. It was a here today, gone tomorrow kind of market, and unfortunately, Pac-Man became a casualty of that. But to say that Pac-Man was a failure in any form would be highly inaccurate. Besides, things weren't too grim for the character. One thing great that came out of the show's cancellation, a year later, in 1984, Namco released Pac-Land to arcades. And guess what? In the Japanese version, the characters and assets resembled the promotional artwork for the games. But in the American version, they lifted everything from the cartoon, down to Pac-Man's design. Red hat, red boots and all. They even managed to use the show's theme song as stage music. So, the impact of Pac-Man's tenure in animation definitely paid off in that aspect. Its impact had lived on from where it got its inspiration in the first place. In other words, everything came full circle. Pac-Man has endured. He is an icon and one of the most recognizable video game characters of all time for no reason. In fact, at the time of this episode's inception, Pac-Man will be celebrating his 43rd birthday, depending on when you view the episode. If that's not longevity, then I can't tell you what is. May he endure even more years to come as his legacy keeps bringing many more gamers to experience his maze-chasing antics. Keep chopping, Pac-Man. Keep chomping.
Nothing like a relaxing Pac snooze after a hard week's work.
ABC didn't only just present one video game adaptation to the lineup. This time, it was something that was a shoo-in for their Saturday morning schedule. Something that was steeped in animation itself. So, without further ado, lo and behold, ABC's other video game adaptation. Their attempt to capture the young audience of America. Dragon Slayer. a game that was a revolutionary step in gaming back in 1983. Blending light gameplay with stunning animation, players were tasked with guiding Dirk the Daring in his quest through a large castle to rescue Princess Daphne from the clutches of Singe the Dragon. This was all done with the use of a mechanic called QTE, which stands for Quick Time Event. The player had to press a direction or one button in sync with the action on screen. Even though it's a tad crude to call it a video game today, back then, many arcade goers loved it. The game was a huge success, and this was all thanks, of course, to the animation itself, all done by the legendary animator himself, Don Bluth, a man who had previously honed his skills in the animation industry working for Disney in 1955. But he truly came to his own with his second tenure at the company in 1971. This second go-around with the studio had him moving up the ranks and becoming the chief animator. His first project in that role? Well, it was none other than Robin Hood, Disney's rendition of the classic English folklore of an outlaw and his merry men stealing from the rich and giving it back to the poor. The film ended up becoming a huge success for Disney at the time, earning $33 million at the box office. The success of Robin Hood was followed by Winnie the Pooh and Tigger 2 the following year. The reception from these two films moved Don up the ladder to the position of directing animator. His first project in his new position, 1971's The Rescuers, which ended up earning a whopping $179 million at the box office. This was Disney's most successful animated film up to this point. The success of the film was followed up by the live-action animation hybrid film Pete's Dragon. Don had proven to be a success at the studio, doing what he loved to do. Knowing that it was time to move on to greener pastures, Don left Disney to establish his animation studio, Don Bluth Productions. His first film under his new venture was 1982's The Secret of NIMH. This first outing displayed the best that he had to offer at the time, a more mature story and very fluid animation across the board. The film was enough of a marvel that it had many critics enamored, including the famed film critic duo, Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert. But unfortunately, the film itself couldn't capture the audience that Don had hoped for. Fast forward to 1983. Don was approached by Rick Dyer from a company called Cinematronics, who wanted to work with him on something that would change gaming, to make a game that utilized animation itself. Don realized that it was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. This was his chance to get more eyes on The Secret of NIMH and his studio, so he took on the job. The rest is history, and that it was indeed. Dragon's Lair ended up becoming one of the most lucrative arcade machines, selling over 1 million units and garnering $30 million upon its release in arcades. In other words, everybody who went to the arcade was playing it. As with any IP that becomes a hot commodity, merch soon followed. So it was a matter of time that Dragon's Lair would end up gracing a time slot on the network's Saturday morning lineup. On September 8th, 1984, ABC had gotten The Adventures of Dirk the Daring on their network. But unfortunately, it wasn't brought to kids courtesy of Don Bluth. See, Don loathed television animation, even though he had worked for Filmation as a layout artist years prior. But Don did end up providing the creators of the series various character model sheets for them to go off of. And who were these creators? Well, it was none other than Ruby Spears Enterprises, of course. Yes, the same studio that brought us Saturday Supercade on CBS. So basically, they were doubling down on giving the children of America more video game adaptations. As for the premise of the series itself, it had Dirk the Daring still being the valiant knight that he was in the coin op. But now he had a squire by the name of Timothy and a white horse named Bertram. They went on missions for the king of and also contended with his arch foe, Singe the Dragon. As for Princess Daphne, she was here as well. She went from this to this. This was changed for obvious reasons. Couldn't have the parents' groups on their back. That's the last thing any studio needed at the time. The episodes themselves were fashioned as one quest, complete with a narrator to narrate Dirk's missions, and also provided the audience with choices for them to pick so Dirk would not meet his demise. It emulated the QuickTime event aspect of the game. Of course, with this being a Saturday morning cartoon, the death scenes in the game did not make the transition to this series. Unfortunately, things weren't meant to be for Dirk's adventures on the lineup. Dragon's Lair only received the standard 13 episodes, and that was it. As for Don Bluth, he went on to make his first truly successful film from his studio, An American Tail, a collaboration with Steven Spielberg no less, and again with Amblin Entertainment with 1988's A Land Before Time. Don Bluth was just fine, especially when the 90s rolled around. As for Dragon's Lair, it did go on to languish in reruns later in the decade on USA's Cartoon Express, a programming block that will get touched upon in due time. Dragon's Lair will also spawn a sequel in the arcades that will be released in the next decade, despite it being made around the same time as the original game. That, of course, being Dragon's Lair 2 Time Warp. And let's not forget Space Ace, which coincidentally was a part of Saturday Supercade. And let's hope one day the live-action adaptation of Dragon's Lair sees the light of day. Well, on the other hand, maybe that's not a good idea after all, considering the state of movies these days. Besides, Dirk's place is in the realm of animation, and kids back in 1984 were lucky to see his gallantry to the fullest. With that said, carry on, O brave knight. Carry on.
Songbird proved to be a better gift than Singer's fabulous golden one.
ABC's Saturday morning cartoon output had become less than stellar as the first half of the 80s pressed on. Cartoons such as Monchichis sought to capitalize on the success of monkey-like dolls that they had gotten in Japan. Mattel truly banked on acquiring the rights to the dolls, making them a huge success here stateside. They even commissioned Hanna-Barbera to create a series. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be a success on the network's lineup and was quickly discarded. So were the dolls that were dropped in 1985. As we know by now, Mattel went on to truly gain commercial and merchandising success with Filmation's He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. NBC had banked on cute, monkey-like creatures and puppies, but they weren't done with adorable characters just yet. ABC aligned themselves with a new studio on the come-up to bring something fresh to the lineup, something on a larger scale. Well, technically, something very small.
I have a very special secret. I'm the only one who knows about tiny people living in our walls called the Littles.
Here it is, The Littles, a cartoon that was most unlikely to be even considered one in the first place. See, the Littles were actually something that's quite familiar to this story so far, something referred to as, for those who have watched up to this point, In other words, The Littles was an insurance policy. Yes, indeed. The Littles were a series of books written by John Peterson released as far back as 1967. It told the story of a family that was small mice-like humans that lived inside the walls of the Biggs residence. These books had proven to be quite popular amongst young readers. So, as with all things kid-related, the networks tried to find the next big thing that catered to the young audience easily. Thus, The Littles emerged on Saturday mornings. And that new studio that I spoke of, well, it was none other than Diffusion Information Communications. But it would be mostly known as DEMISE Enterprises, a studio that had been established in France by Jean Chalopin in 1971. DEMISE Enterprises was a meager studio that was just trying to break their way into the industry. And like they say, you have to go where the money is. In this case, America. This is where Andy Hayward came in. At first, he was just in charge of bringing their productions here, but soon he had partnered with them. Andy also had experience in the field, as he previously worked for Hanna-Barbera. Together, they were responsible for bringing Inspector Gadget to airwaves in 1983. This wouldn't only be the year it premiered, but also when The Littles premiered as well, 2 days before Inspector Gadget even aired in syndication. So DEMISE Enterprises had a lot to prove right out of the gate. One thing to note is that DEMISE Enterprises wasn't much of an animation studio around this time. At the beginning of their tenure, they mostly outsourced. As aforementioned, it had become a common practice. So for this outing, DEMISE decided to employ the services of a studio quite familiar at this point in our story. Of course, I speak of none other than TMS. As you may know by now, this was definitely not the only series that they had dabbled with. Not by a long shot. As for the series itself, DEMISE took liberties with the source material. First of all, the parents William and Wilma Little were renamed Frank and Helen respectively. Uncle Pete was now Grandpa Little. Rounding out the cast was Dinky, who was their nephew by the way, and quite different from his book counterpart. In the books, he was a competent, adventurous type who liked to fly his glider. But in the anime series, he was quite clumsy, goofy, and always got into trouble, and flew a plane with disastrous results. And then you had Tom and Lucy Little, who were good-natured and helpful siblings that were always along for the ride with cousin and grandpa. They went on various adventures around the house and beyond. Aiding them from time to time was their only companion, Henry Biggs, who knew of their existence. The Littles, as you can imagine, was quite tame compared to what was on air at the time. And that's saying a lot. Most episodes of the series tended to focus on moral lessons, which was quite perfect as far as ABC's Broadcast Standards and Practices Department was concerned. Fortunately, the young audience had gravitated to the exploits of the Little family. The Littles was a hit on the network's lineup. This garnered it a second season, and it introduced a new character to the fold by the name of Ashley Little, and quite the explanation of how Henry first met the Littles in the intro. This season would also have the Littles reading actual real-life letters that kids sent in at the end of the episode. They even taught kids how to do arts and craft projects. If this isn't above and beyond for a cartoon, then I don't know what is. Speaking of above and beyond, DEMISE would venture into new territory on May 25th, 1985, the box office, with their very first theatrical release, Here Comes the Littles. This animated film offering was a combination of the animated series and the books. The premise had Henry's parents going on a trip to Africa, and his mean-spirited uncle Augustus moves in to seize guardianship of Henry. Henry stumbles upon the Littles for the very first time in his home. The Littles must expose Augustus's plot to steal Henry's home. The film ended up gaining moderate success at the box office, earning $6.5 million. But whereas it was a hit with the younger audience, critics weren't particularly kind to it, with one critic going as far as to say that the film was silly and boring. Ouch. Nevertheless, the Littles were languishing and getting the kind of attention that most merchandising companies wished they had at the time. With the success of its merchandising and the young audience's reception of the movie, it made ABC greenlight a third season on ABC. This season, which mostly comprised of only 8 episodes in total, had the Littles venture outside of their usual trappings. They stowed away in Henry's suitcase and went on a world traveling trip. The Littles wouldn't get a 4th season, but despite that, Deke did manage to squeeze out another movie, a made-for-TV movie in 1986, which was later broken up into 3 half-hour episodes upon its rerun tenure in syndication. In all, The Littles was just only the tip of the iceberg for Deke Enterprises, as we will see later on. As for the series' impact on Saturday mornings, it had carved out a path for what was to come in children's entertainment going forward into the 1980s. I guess things really do come in big packages. Or in this case, little.
You can't stop the Littles 'cause the Littles don't stop.
Despite ABC not having a strong lineup during the earlier part of the 1980s, it doesn't mean they weren't bringing new ideas when it came to their anime offerings. Case in point, ABC premiered The Mighty Orbots, a very special cartoon to the lineup. If it looks somewhat familiar, it should. This one was a collaboration between ABC, MGM, Intermedia Entertainment, TMS. Told you they were on a roll. The Mighty Orbots was the network's attempt at creating an anime for the Saturday morning market. A series that was created by Barry Glasser and spearheaded by the wonderful Fred Silverman himself. Mind you, as already told, there was an anime that was already super popular around this time in syndication. That, of course, being Voltron, Defender of the Universe. On top of being the first anime program to be presented in stereo, Voltron was a monster hit in syndication, garnering great revenue in merchandising. So ABC figured they had to compete with what was going on in the syndicated cartoon market. You may be wondering why I just referred to it as an anime. See, on top of it being produced by TMS Entertainment, one of the greatest anime directors helmed this series. It was none other than Osamu Dezaki, in collaboration with Akio Sugino. Let me enlighten you if you aren't familiar with these two. See, Osamu was already making waves in Japan in the earlier part of the 1980s. He had produced Astra Nojo, the aforementioned space adventure Cobra, and helmed such movies as Gogol 13, The Professional, and Blackjack. Akio Sugino had worked alongside Osamu on character designs. Any anime fan knows how mature those stories were. Now they were tasked to bring a project solely made for an American audience and way tamer than their previous works. As for the premise for this outing, it took place on a 23rd century Earth, a peaceful world that was in alliance with the United Planets and formed the Galactic Patrol. This was for good reason, because the villainous Umbra and its organization, Shadow, wanted to rule the galaxy. But a genius teenage robot scientist by the name of Rob Simmons stood in its way as he called upon his team of superpowered robots dubbed the Mighty Orbots. A team of 6 consisted of Tor, the toughest robot in the group. Then there was Bo and Boo, twin robots. Bort, Ono, Rob's lab assistant, and lastly, Crunch. Taking a cue from Voltron itself, they formed together to make a gigantic super robot to fight the evil that Shadow waged across the galaxy. Unfortunately, the Mighty Autobots only lasted for a single season. Usually when a cartoon series got canceled back then, it was because of two reasons. The ratings were low, or the merchandising hadn't sold too well. Supposedly, the series had gotten a great reception on the lineup, but not enough to beat out Muppet Babies and the Smurfs, which were on the same time slot, of course. But this wasn't the case when it came to the Mighty Autobots. So what really happened? Well, the series was canceled due to a lawsuit brought upon Tonka Corporation. See, around the same time, Tonka were making waves with their toy line, the GoBots, which they had started selling in 1983. The GoBots were a direct competitor to Hasbro and their toy line, the Transformers, as they vied for the top spot on the toy charts. Soon, they premiered their own cartoon series, The Challenge of the GoBots, in first-run syndication on September 8th, 1984. And guess what else premiered that day? The Mighty Autobots. So now, they didn't only have the Transformers to contend with, but also a series that was gaining acclaim from the young audience at the time. Even though it was only the 5-part miniseries that introduced the GoBots, the toy line was gaining traction because of it. The following year, on September 15th, 1985, a full-length series debuted on the Fantastic World of Hanna-Barbera programming block. But the mere presence of the Mighty Autobots on Saturday mornings still threatened them. So in March of 1985, Tonka Corporation dragged TMS Entertainment into the court system in Minnesota. They claimed that TMS had infringed on their trademark with the Mighty Autobots and cited that the intellectual properties were too similar to one another. The toy manufacturer had licensed the Machine Robo property, which GoBots was based upon, right out of Japan. So as far as they were concerned, they had a lot riding on the GoBots' success in retail. Their big play was to stop TMS from gaining any sort of revenue from merchandising and put an absolute damper on their bottom line. Long story short, TMS had lost the lawsuit, and thus they couldn't move forward with creating anything related to the Mighty Autobots. No toys, which were planned to be released during its run, and no second season. This, unfortunately, was the true nature of the business, and there were many winners and losers along the way. TMS became a casualty of competitive greed. But of course, we all know by now how TMS would fare afterward. They would be just fine, in other words. As for the Mighty Autobots, they have been only remembered by those who had seen it, given if they weren't watching Muppet Babies or the Smurfs. But today, they are known for doing something instrumental for the medium as a whole. That is anime's bigger presence on Saturday morning lineups going forward. Let's just say that many more will end up seeking out the animes who resided on the 4th floor. Thanks a lot, Mighty Autobots. Thanks a lot.
Gee, sure nice to have things back to normal.